Hello, boys and girls. I hope you are having a wonderful, wonderful day. I am so excited to be back to read another chapter of Pippi in the South Seas to you. Today we are ready for chapter 9, which is called Pippi Talks Sense to Jim and Buck. So we don't know who Jim and Buck are, but we know that Pippi is very good at talking sense into people. So let's dive in, let's find out who they are, and let's find out what she says to talk some sense into them. Alrighty. The shark's teeth had only scratched Tommy's leg, and when he had calmed down, he still wanted to continue to climb to the big cave. Pippi twisted strands of hibiscus flower into a stout rope and tied it to a stone. Then, lightly as a mountain goat, she hopped over to the cave and secured the other end of the rope there. Now even Anika dared to climb to the cave. When you had a steady rope to hang on to, it was easy. It was a wonderful cave and so big that all the children were able to get inside without any trouble. This cave is almost better than our hollow oak at Villa Vilcula, said Tommy. No, not better, but just as good, said Anika, who felt a lump in her throat at the thought of the oak and didn't want to admit that anything could be better. Momo showed the visitors how much coconut and breadfruit were stored in the cave. One would be able to live there for several weeks without starving to death. Moana showed them a hollow bamboo cane filled with the most beautiful pearls. She gave Pippi and Tommy and Anika each a handful. Nice marbles you have to play marbles with this in country. Pippi looked at her and smiled. Nice marbles, you have to play marbles with this in these countries, said Pippi. It was delightful to sit at the opening of the cave and to look out over the sea, glittering in the sunlight. And it was great fun to lie on one's tummy and spit into the water. Tommy announced a contest in the long-distance spitting. Momo was terribly good at it, but he still wasn't able to beat Pippi. She had a way of forcing the spit through her front teeth, which no one could imitate. If it's drizzling over in New Zealand today, said Pippi, it's my fault. Tommy and Anika didn't do so well. No, northern children no can spit, said Momo with a superior air. He didn't quite consider Pippi as being one of the northern children. So northern children can't spit? Said Pippi. You don't know what you're talking about. That is taught to them in school from the first grade. Long distance spitting and altitude spitting and sprint spitting. You ought to see Tommy and Anika's teacher. Man, can she spit! She won first prize in sprint spitting. The whole town cheers when she runs around spitting to the beat of the band. Bah, said Tommy and Anika. Pippi raised her hand to shield her eyes from the glare and looked out to sea. I see a ship out there, she said. A tiny steamer. I wonder what it's doing in these parts. And she had a reason to wonder. The steamer was headed towards Kerkerdut Island at a good clip. On board, there were several South Sea Islanders and 2 white men. Their names were Jim and Buck. They were dirty, coarse-looking men who looked like real bandits. And that is exactly what they were. Once, when Captain Longstocking was in the shop where he bought supplies, Jim and Buck had been there too. They had seen Captain Longstocking put a couple of unusually large and beautiful pearls on the counter, and had heard him say that on Kerkerdut Island, the children used pearls like these to play marbles with. Well, since that day, they had only one goal, and that was to go to the island and try and get a hold of a quantity of pearls. They knew that Captain Longstocking was very strong, and they also had a healthy respect for the crew of the Hoptoad. They therefore decided to take advantage of an opportunity when all the men were away on a hunt. Now their chance had come. Hiding behind an island close by, they had seen through their binoculars Captain Longstocking, his crew, and all the Kerkerduts paddle away from the island. They were only waiting until the canoes were out of sight. "Drop the anchor!" shouted Buck when the ship was close to the island. Pippi and all the other children watched them in silence from the cave up above. The men dropped anchor, and Jim and Buck jumped into a skiff and rowed ashore. The crew were given orders to stay on board. "Now we'll sneak up to the village and overtake them," said Jim. "Probably only the women and children are at home." "Yes," said Buck. "And besides, there were so many women in the canoes, I should think that only the children were left on the island." "I hope they're playing marbles." His voice carried clearly over the water. "Why?" Pippi shouted from the cave. "Do you especially like playing with marbles? I think it's just as much fun to play leapfrog." Jim and Buck turned around in astonishment and saw Pippi and all of the children sticking their heads out from the cave. A delighted grin spread across their faces. "There we have the kids," said Jim. "Perfect," said Buck. "This is in the bag." But they decided nevertheless to play it safe and be sly. No one could know where the children kept their pearls, and therefore it was best to try to win them over. The men pretended that they hadn't come to Crooked Island to find pearls at all, but were just out for a nice little excursion. They felt hot and sticky, and Buck suggested that they begin with going for a swim. "I'll row back and forth and fetch our bathing trunks," he said. This he did. In the meantime, Jim stood alone on the shore. Is there any good beach around here?" he called to the children in a friendly voice. "Wonderful! They're all over the place," said Pippi. "They're absolutely wonderful for sharks. In fact, the sharks come here every day." "Nonsense," said Jim. "I don't see any sharks." But he was a little worried just the same. Because when Buck came back with the bathing trunks, he told him what Pippi had said. "Nonsense," said Buck, and he shouted to Pippi, "Are you the one who is saying it's dangerous to swim here?" "No," said Pippi. "I never said it was too dangerous." Oh, I lost my spot. "That's funny," said Jim. "Didn't you just tell me that there were sharks here?" "Yes, that's what I said. But dangerous? No. That I wouldn't say. My grandfather swam here last year." "Well then," said Buck. "And grandfather got back from the hospital already last Friday," Pippi went on, "with the fanciest wooden leg you would have ever seen. He says it is absolutely irreplaceable when he goes out to fight." "You know what I think?" said Buck. "I think you're telling us a bunch of fibs. Your grandfather must be an old man. I'm sure that he doesn't want to get into any fights." "That's what you think," cried Pippi in a shrill voice. "He's the most ill-tempered old man who has ever hit his opponent on the head with a wooden leg. If he can't get in a fight from morning till night, he's absolutely miserable. Then he gets into such a rage that he bites himself on the nose." "What nonsense," said Buck. "No one can bite himself on the nose." "Oh, yes, they can," Pippi insisted. "He climbs up on a chair." Buck paused and thought about this for a while, but then he disagreed. "I don't feel like listening to your silly chatter any longer. Come on, Jim, let's put our swimming trunks on. Besides, I'd like to have you know that my grandfather has the largest nose and the longest nose in the whole world." He has 5 parrots, and all of them can sit next to each other on his nose. By now, Buck was really angry. You little red-headed liar! Do you know that you're the worst liar I've ever met? Aren't you ashamed of yourself? Aren't you really trying to make me believe that 5 parrots can sit in a row on your grandfather's nose? You better confess right now that it's a lie. Yes, said Pippi sadly. It is a lie. There, you see, said Buck. Isn't that what I said? It's a terrible, horrible, horrible lie, said Pippi, still sadder. That's what I thought from the beginning, said Buck. Because the 5th parrot, sobbed Pippi and burst out into a flood of tears. The 5th parrot, there's not enough room, and so he has to stand on only one leg. Get lost, said Buck, and he and Jim went behind a bush to get change into their swim trunks. Pippi, you don't even have a grandfather, said Anika reproachfully. No, said Pippi happily. Must I have a grandfather? Buck was the first one to come out in his bathing suit. He made an elegant dive from a cliff into the sea and swam out. The children up in the cave watched with great interest. Then they spotted a shark fin, which flashed above the surface of the water for a second. Shark! Shark! Cried Momo. Buck, who was treading water and enjoying himself immensely, turned around and saw the terrible creature coming toward him. There has probably never been anyone who could swim as fast as Buck swam in that moment. In 2 seconds split, he had reached the shore and rushed out of the water. He was both frightened and furious. And it seemed as if he thought this was all Pippi's fault that there were sharks in the water. Aren't you ashamed of yourself, you nasty little girl? He screamed. The sea is full of sharks! Have I said anything else? Pippi asked sweetly and tilted her head to one side. I don't always lie, you see. Jim and Buck went behind the bush to put on their normal clothes again. They felt that now was the time to begin thinking about the pearls. No one could tell how long Captain Longstocking and the others were going to be away. Listen, children, said Buck. I heard someone say that there were some good oyster beds in these regions. Do you know if it's true? I'll say, said Pippi. Oyster shells go crunch, crunch under your feet whenever you walk down there at the bottom of the sea. Go down and see for yourself. But Buck didn't want to do that. There are great big pearls in every oyster, said Pippi, about like this one. And she held up a giant shimmering pearl. Jim and Buck got so excited that they could hardly stand still. Hey, do you have any more of those? Said Jim. We would like to buy them from you. This was a lie. Jim and Buck had no money with which to buy pearls. They only wanted to steal them and be dishonest. Yes, we have at least 10 or 12 quarts of pearls up here in the cave, said Pippi. Jim and Buck were unable to hide their delight. Wonderful, said Buck. Bring them down here and we'll buy all of them. Oh no, cried Pippi. What are the poor children going to use to play marbles with afterward? Have you thought about that? There was a lot of discussion back and forth before Jim and Buck realized that it would be impossible to get the pearls by clever maneuvering. But what they could get by clever maneuvering, they decided to take... Ooh, I misread. I better go back, read it again, and see if it makes sense this time. Let me try it out. But what they couldn't get by clever maneuvering, they decided to take by force. Now they at least knew where the pearls were. The only thing they had to do was climb over to the cave and take them. Climb over to the cave. Yes, that was the issue. During the discussion, Pippi had carefully removed the hibiscus rope, which was now safely inside the cave with the children. Jim and Buck didn't think that the climb to the cave looked very inviting, but there didn't seem to be any other way to get the pearls. "You do it, Jim," said Buck. "No way! You do it, Buck," said Jim. "No, you do it, Jim," said Buck. He was bigger and stronger than Jim. So Jim started climbing. He frantically grabbed hold of the jutting rocks that he could reach, and a cold sweat poured down his back. "Hold on for heaven's sake so you don't fall down," said Pippi in an encouraging way. But then Jim fell in. Buck was shouting at him on the beach. Jim was screaming because there were 2 sharks headed in his direction. When they were no more than 3 feet in front of him, Pippi threw down a coconut right in front of their snouts. That scared them away just long enough for Jim to swim to the shore and crawl up on the little plateau. There was water running in rivulets from his clothing, and he looked absolutely miserable. But still, Buck was scolding him. "Will you do it yourself and see how easy it is?" said Jim. "Yeah, okay, I'll show you how easy it is," said Buck. And he started to climb. All the children watched him. Anika was almost a bit frightened as she watched him coming closer. "Uh-oh, don't climb there, you'll fall in," said Pippi. "Where?" said Buck. "There," said Pippi, pointing. Buck looked down at his feet. "A lot of coconuts get wasted this way," said Pippi, a moment later when she had thrown one into the sea to prevent the sharks from eating up Buck, who was desperately floundering around in the water as he had fallen straight in. But up he came, mad as a hornet, and he certainly wasn't one to be afraid. He immediately started climbing again, because he had made up his mind, once and for all, to make his way into the cave and get his hands on those pearls. This time, he managed much, much better. When he was almost at the opening of the cave, he called out triumphantly, "Now, you little kids, this time you're going to get it!" Then Pippi stuck out her index finger and poked him in the stomach. There was a splash. "You could have at least taken this with you when you took off," Pippi shouted after him as she landed a coconut bang on the snout of the shark that was coming too close. But more sharks came and she had to throw more coconuts. One of them accidentally hit Buck on the head. "Ooh, oh dear, was that you?" said Pippi when Buck yelled. "Well, I'm sorry, but from up here you look like a big nasty shark." Jim and Buck decided now to sit it out until the children were forced to come down. "When they get hungry, they'll leave there," said Buck grimly, "and then they'll see something." He shouted to the children, "I feel sorry for you if you're going to have to sit in that cave until you starve to death." "Aw, you have a kind heart," said Pippi, "but you won't have to worry about us for the next 2 weeks. Then we might have to start rationing the coconuts a little." She cracked open a big coconut, drank the milk, and ate the wonderful meat inside. Jim and Buck were upset. The sun was setting and they began to make preparations to spend the night ashore. They didn't dare row out to the steamer to sleep because then the children would get away with all of the pearls. They laid down on the hard rocks in their wet clothes. It was very uncomfortable. We've got a picture. They don't look like friendly people. Up in the cave, all the children were merrily sitting around, eating coconuts and mashed breadfruit. It was so good, and the whole situation was just so exciting and pleasant. Once in a while, they would stick out their heads to look at Jim and Buck. But by now, it was so dark that they could only see the fuzzy outline of the men on the plateau below. But they could still hear them talking down below. Suddenly, there was a huge rain shower of tropical and violent winds and rains. The rain came down in torrents. Pippi stuck the tip of her nose out of the cave. "You certainly are the lucky ones," she shouted to Jim and Buck. "What do you mean by that?" said Buck hopefully. He thought that perhaps the children had changed their minds and wanted to give them the pearls. "What do you mean by saying that we're lucky?" "I mean, just think how lucky it is that you were already soaked when this rainstorm came. Otherwise, you would have gotten soaking wet all over again." More complaining could be heard from down on the plateau, but it was impossible to tell if it was Jim or Buck. "Good night and sleep well," said Pippi, "because that's what we're going to do now." All the children lay down on the floor of the cave. Tommy and Danica lay one on either side of Pippi, holding her hands. They were quite comfortable. It was so warm and snug in the cave. And outside, the rain poured down. And that is the end of Chapter 9. Make sure you join us tomorrow for Chapter 10 of Pippi in the South Seas. And Chapter 10 will be called Pippi Gets Bored with Jim and Buck. So make sure you join us to find out what happens. Bye!